Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is lovely to be with you all today. I am Celeste Watkins Hayes, the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. I'm also founding director of the Center for Racial Justice. And as we gather today, I welcome you in from the cold. Thank you for being here in this cold for this very special event with our distinguished speaker, journalist, and author, Rachel Swarns, in honor of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Today's event is presented in partnership with the Wallace House Center for Journalists and the Center for Racial Justice. This gathering is part of the University of Michigan's annual MLK Symposium. Among the nearly 40 events held every year at the university honoring the life and work of Dr. King, our discussion with Rachel Swarns is one of 4 events specifically addressing reparations. Rachel Swarns is a contributing writer for the New York Times, a journalism professor at New York University, and an author. Her recent book, The 272, which we will talk about today, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church, was selected as one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times Book Review. The New Yorker, Time Magazine. Oh, let me pause because there are more. New York Times Book Review, The New Yorker, Time Magazine, Washington Post, Chicago Public Library, and Kirkus Reviews. Now we should clap. Before writing this book, her reporting on this topic started a national conversation about the responsibilities of U.S. universities with ties to slavery. We are honored to have her with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Lynette Clemenson, director of Wallace House Center for Journalists, home of the Knight Wallace Fellowship Program and the Livingston Awards. Lynette was an international and national correspondent for Newsweek and a national correspondent for the New York Times, where she and Rachel were close colleagues. She came to the University of Michigan, and we are so lucky to have her, from NPR, where she was senior director of strategy and content initiatives. I can't say it enough. We're so excited to hear from this conversation. We're so lucky to have you both in conversation together. And Lynette, I will turn it over to you as we warmly welcome Rachel Swarns.
Thank you all for being here. I always say that at the beginning of an event, and today I really mean thank you for being here. The weather was so bad this morning, and I told Rachel, I was like, I don't know if anyone's going to come. And she's been deeply immersed in religious studies lately, and she said,
if 2 or 3 are gathered in my name.
Yes. So
it's all good.
I actually think that her goodwill about the fact that we might have an empty room somehow produced all of you here today. So I really appreciate you coming out. And I want to thank, of course, the Ford School and the Center for Racial Justice, who are such close partners of ours on campus. Celeste and I are always cooking up ideas, and whenever I say, why don't we do this? I can always count on her to say, yes, let's do that. So thank you. Also, the Center for Social Solutions and Dr. Earl Lewis here. Earl, could you please stand? As Dean Watkins Hayes mentioned, this is one of 4 events that's part of the MLK Symposium this year that touches on the theme of reparations. And the Center for Social Solutions has among its pillars slavery, historic and modern day, and some of the work they're doing. On Monday, if any of you participated in the symposium events on Monday, they premiered a film that they've been working on with WQED, PBS, WGBH in Boston called The Cost of Inheritance. It also is running on the PRI World Channel on your PBS station. And so that I mention that, one, because it's a great film that deals with some of the themes we'll be talking about today, but also because the story that we will be talking about today, specifically about the Jesuits' history with slavery and Georgetown University, factors prominently in the film. So I want to mention that. Also, the Department of Afro and African American Studies, the Donia Center for Human Rights, the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. And I think, it's significant to mention those partners, because when we talk about the themes that we are going to be dealing with today, it touches on so many scholarly areas that we are pursuing at the university. Of course, history, of course, human rights, of course, sociology, all of these things, social justice. And so finding a way to deal with such historic material that was in many ways forgotten, and to make it as current as this book succeeds in doing, I'm really happy to share that with you today. We also are streaming this conversation. I want to thank the people who are following us online. We'll save time at the end for Q&A. We'll have microphones to pass, and my colleagues will stand when we get to that portion. And if you wave your hand, we'll make sure someone takes your questions. Our local bookseller, Book Suite, is our bookseller for the day. I live on the north side, so woohoo for Book Suite. And they are selling Rachel's book, The 272, today. If you didn't have a chance to buy it before the event, they'll bring a table up and we'll have it after, and Rachel will be signing books. So with that, I would like to start. And as Celeste mentioned, Rachel and I are former colleagues. She is also my dearest friend in the world. And I sort of who stand in as her agent sometimes. When I hear her introduced as a contributing writer for the New York Times, I often say, Rachel, that needs to be edited. Because yes, now, because she has been working on this, she is a contributing editor for the New York Times, but she was a New York Times correspondent for 22 years until she took a leave to work on this full time. She's reported from Russia, from Cuba, from Guatemala. She's a Latin American expert. When we met more than 20 years ago, she had just come to the Washington Bureau from being the bureau chief in Johannesburg. And she's done just about every kind of journalism job there is to do, and is one of the best reporters I know. It shows up in the narrative in this book. And the reason that Wallace House Center for Journalists does events like this is because we feel it is part of our mission to help make transparent for people how journalists go about doing their work and why journalism is important in society. And this story, we're here to talk about a book, but I want to start, and if you saw my son bring my phone up to me when we started, it wasn't because I'm going to be texting during the event. It's because it was the easiest way for me to pull up the original story in the New York Times. On April 16th, 2016, Rachel's story, which she got a tip about, was a story that someone else couldn't do or wasn't sure was a story. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And they said, are you interested in this? Can you maybe do something with this? It ended up on the front page of the New York Times. The human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for the plantations of the Deep South. Some slaves pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day in the fall of 1838, no one was spared. Not the 2-month-old baby and her mother, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. Their panic and desperation would be mostly forgotten for more than a century. But this was no ordinary slave sale. The enslaved African Americans had belonged to the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests, and they were sold, along with scores of others, to help secure the future of the premier Catholic institution of higher learning at the time, known today as Georgetown University. It's what I would call a good lead. Sometimes at the Times, they say, how do you get on the front page? a lot of times you have to write your way onto the front page. You write something so compelling that the editors have to make the decision that it belongs on the front page. This story belonged on the front page, and it caused quite a conversation. We're going to assume that people have not had a chance to read the book. This story starts talking about a young boy who's 13, Cornelius Hawkins. When I read this book, I have, as you know, become very attached to a man named Harry Mahoney. And I want you to start by just telling us who these people were, who they are, and what this story is about.
Thank you all for coming in such crazy weather. It's so good to be here.
Can you hear Rachel in the back? No, I think we have to move your mic up.
Let's see.
Can I just put a plug in for sort of gender representation in miking? Women wear scarves, and it's hard with scarves and these mics.
Okay, is that better? Yes? Okay, yeah, I can even hear it's better, okay.
Yes.
So as Lynette mentioned, I wrote this story that ran in the New York Times in 2016, and I'll tell you a little bit about how it came to me. But as she read from that first article that I wrote, 272 men, women, and children were sold to help save this institution we now know as Georgetown University. And if you're someone like me who writes about slavery, you're aware that there are folks who immediately will say, oh, no thank you, not interested, don't want to hear about it. So as a journalist, I'm often thinking about audience and how to bring people in. In that article, I decided to focus on a boy and to tell the story of how he was torn away from the world that he knew. In the book, I decided to focus on a family. 272 people were sold, scores of families. I would tell the story of one. And I decided to tell the story of the Mahoneys because their experience parallels the emergence of the Catholic Church in the United States and the Church's reliance on slavery. And Catholic priests had established Georgetown as the first Catholic institution of higher learning in the United States. So the family story starts with a matriarch, a Black woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in Maryland, which some of you may know was established in part as a refuge for Catholics who were discriminated against in England. She arrives in the late 1600s, and she arrives as an indentured servant, a free person. And she came, as many indentured servants did. We know a little bit about this kind of history. She would come, she had a contract, she would serve her term of years, and then she would go on to live her life as a free person, and that was certainly her dream. But Anne arrived at a time of transition in Maryland when the economy, which had been based on one that relied on indentured servants, was transitioning to one that relied on slave labor. She was forced into slavery. Her contract was burned. She lost everything. Everything except her story. And her story was simple. She passed it on to her children and her grandchildren and to all of the people around her. And it was this: our liberty was stolen and we should be free people. And her descendants carried that story on, and they resisted. She had descendants who killed an overseer and were executed. She had descendants who took the Jesuits to court, sued the Jesuits to try to garner their freedom. Only a handful were successful, so future generations had to find another way. She has a descendant by the name of Harry Mahoney, who during the War of 1812 saved the wealth of the church, and in so doing garnered a promise from the Jesuit priests that as a reward for his loyalty and his courage, that neither he nor his family would ever be sold. And that promise was broken in that mass sale of 1838 that I first wrote about.
And I you know, that story, the scene in the book where Harry takes the prized possessions, including oil, investments, and the things that the Jesuits wanted protected when they knew the British were coming. And he takes his family and he runs into the woods, and they wait in a cabin for days, and he protects this, and he is given this promise. And when I read that, it made me think throughout the book that this is a story about family, this is a story about faith, and it's a story about broken promises. First, the broken promise to Anne Joyce, and then the broken promise to her descendant, Harry Mahoney. And I should say here, because I think we need to establish it early for everyone in the room, you are a practicing Catholic, you go to Mass weekly, and you didn't know anything about this history. And among the stories, if anyone's familiar with Rachel's byline in the Times, when the book came out, she also wrote a story that started a lot of conversation because people expected her to renounce her faith after doing this research, and something different happened. And so I think we should probably take a moment to address that.
So, you know, it's funny because this story came to me because a colleague of mine got a tip from a Georgetown alum who was trying to pitch the story on this 19th century slave sale, and my colleague was kind of like, a slave sale in 1838, is that even a story? And I always say it's my good fortune that she didn't delete the email, and she didn't because she remembered that I had written a book about Michelle Obama and her ancestors, enslaved ancestors, so she thought I might know something about this. So for a long time, when I talked about my work, I didn't talk about my Catholicism, being a Black woman and being Catholic, because truly this came to me another way. But of course, you know, I have reflected a good deal about this, because what I learned during my research was that we're not just talking about slavery, you know, saving Georgetown. The very foundations of the Catholic Church were built by priests who relied on slavery. Priests who relied on slave sales and enslaved laborers built and established the first archdiocese, the nation's first cathedral, the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. The priests who operated and ran a plantation and sold people established the nation's first Catholic seminary. So it was really foundational. And as I am, you know, doing this research, digging into the archives, you know, you're reading things that are, a girl swapped for a horse. Children sold from their parents as punishment. People housed in shelters that are described by the priests themselves as unfit for human habitation. And so, you know, this is difficult reading, families torn apart. At the same time, though, as Lynette said, this is a story of heartbreak for sure, but it is also a story of resilience and of family and faith. And many of these families, even though they were betrayed by the church, ultimately stayed in the church and did more than stay in the church. Many became lay leaders and religious leaders in the church and decided that they would work to make the church more responsive to and more reflective of Black Catholics. And I like to think that they felt that this church did not belong to those sinful men, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit did not belong to those priests, that the church belonged to them as well. And as someone who grew up in the North, in New York, who grew up with this image of a northern church, the Catholic Church, right? A northern church, an immigrant church. Enslaved people have been almost entirely left out of the origin story that is traditionally told about the Catholic Church. For me, learning about this history and learning about these families has been, deeply inspiring, actually. Sometimes people want to shake me and say, "Why did you stay?" And I don't know, there's something about this experience and their resilience and their strength that actually is inspiring.
And so let's talk about, because it is, the things that Rachel just mentioned, a girl being swapped for a horse, a baby being taken away from her parents as punishment, it's worth noting that the story is not, it is certainly wrenching in points, but it's a beautiful story of resilience. And it's a story, I think, that presents to us as the reader really complex characters. And I think this is important today because in our social media culture, it's very easy to strip things down to this is good and this is bad. This person is righteous and this person or cause is evil. And journalists certainly should know that that is almost never true. It's never true, right? People and issues and causes and topics are complex. And the Jesuits, there were so many archival materials that you gained access to that you were able to paint these larger-than-life figures who were legitimately very captivating characters with this flaw that they didn't see these people as people. So talk about, for a moment, we'll then join them with the Mahonies, but talk about Mulady and who he was.
So, people ask, as I did, as a Catholic, how is this possible? And I think it's important to say that, the Catholic, these priests, as Lynette pointed out, were complicated. Unlike many white people at the time, they didn't view the enslaved as brutes, as animals. They didn't. They saw them as human beings, and as human beings with souls, and as human beings with souls that needed tending, and that they needed to do the tending at the very same time that they thought it was fine, and not only thought it was fine, but did buy and sell their bodies. There was no bar from Rome. It takes a long time for the Catholic Church in the US and for Rome to criticize. There are, Rome does talk about and discourage and bar the enslavement of the indigenous in the Americas, but the buying and selling of black bodies occurs for a very long time. And she talked about the complexity of the priests and Mulady. And, I think it's important to say that even as these priests engaged in this practice, that there were voices all along the way that raised questions and raised concerns about this, about the morality of it, about the ethics of it. And I say that before I tell you about Mulady, because there are folks who will say when you write about slavery, don't bring your 21st century morality to this history. It was legal, it was the time. But I'm here to tell you that these priests wrestled with these questions in real time. So, Thomas Mulady, he was a member of the first American-born generation of Jesuit priests who were sent off to Rome to be educated and to be leaders of the church. And he was one of a number of these men who grew up knowing slavery up close. His father enslaved people. He saw it in his own home. And Milady was actually something of a visionary. He comes to run Georgetown and then the Jesuit province itself, the main structure of the Jesuits in the United States. And he looks around and he says, you know, this Catholic Church that was established as this rural plantation-based church, this isn't the future. And he looks up north, and what he sees is waves of immigrants from Europe pouring into the cities. Irish immigrants, Catholic immigrants, and he says, that's the future. That's where we have to position ourselves. We need to establish a constellation of universities, of colleges, to serve these people. And of course, he was right. His vision was entirely right. But the Jesuits, because of mismanagement and economic troubles, did not have the money to do this. And so the way to make this vision a reality for him was quite clear. It was to sell their largest assets, which were the 272 men, women, and children, to expand the Catholic Church and to make this vision a reality.
And to put this into context, the sale, when it happened in 1838...
It's one of the largest documented sales of the time.
So let that sink in. And I think, when you think about this story, when we think about the history of slavery, first of all, we think about the South. We don't think about Maryland. We think about, we have pictures from movies of slave sales and people being paraded through the streets. But the scale of this particular sale was one of the largest in recorded history of this era. And it's like, who knew about this before the story ran or the book? How many Catholics in the room? How many people educated in Catholic institutions? And no one raised their hand to say that they knew about this. And so, I think that this is also relevant in the context of today, when this book is being written at a time when we are actively in the United States trying to keep history from being taught in schools. And so, yes, and it's right there. And I'm always careful when I talk about the story, because it is not quite true that as a journalist you broke this story, because it wasn't unknown. The Jesuits and Georgetown and people who study Jesuit history knew of this sale. What was the difference, and how did this come up when it did?
So I think it's really important to know that, the Jesuits had, kept, a vast quantity of records. They had, internally written about the sale. There was a Jesuit who wrote a book in the early 2000s about the moral thinking of the Jesuits in their slaveholding. One of the things that struck me as a journalist when I was looking at this, though, was that for me, when I think about slavery, I think about its legacies and how we live with it today. So what really struck me was kind of, how does this resonate with us here and now? And my story was the first to report on the community of descendants, which was very, very small. And what happened is that when I first got that tip from that CEO of a tech company, that Georgetown alum, Georgetown had decided that they were going to start a working group to look at its history. Students had protested that Milady's name was on a building, for instance, and needed they wanted it to be changed. The administration changed the names, but this guy up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Richard Cellini, said, okay, well, there are protests, the names are changed, but 272 people were sold. What happened to them? And he was told by a member of this working group, a faculty member at Georgetown, that they all died. He said, 272 people? Nearly 300 people? They all died. He didn't believe it for a second. He's a white guy who had never been involved really in racial justice issues or social justice issues before. But he loved Georgetown, and he felt like Georgetown kind of owed its existence to these people. So he was also pretty well off, so he hired some genealogists and decided to find out what happened. And so when he came to us, his team had identified a handful of descendants. And so the singular thing that my story did was bring this history to a national audience and break the news of these descendants.
Yeah. And when the story ran, what happened? What was the response?
You never know kind of how people will respond. I felt like this was urgent to me. And you have to remember that this was before the 1619 Project. Ta-Nehisi Coates had written his powerful case for reparations for the Atlantic, but this kind of work of writing about history and about slavery in, the pages of a newspaper that really focuses on the here and now was not something that we really did very often, so we didn't know. But the headline of the story was, I think,
what does it owe?
272 people were sold to save Georgetown. What does it owe their descendants? And more than 1 million people read that story online. It was shared by thousands of people on social media. And one of the things that was really important to me was first in telling this story about bringing kind of this history to light. And in part, what I was thinking about was, again, my first book was about Michelle Obama and her ancestors, looking at how slavery shaped American families. This was looking at how slavery shaped American institutions, which I thought was something that we really needed to explore. And I wanted to find, we knew there were a handful of descendants, I thought there were more. So with that main story, we ran a companion piece. And we asked readers, do you have a connection to this sale? One of the things that was really important and helpful in writing about these people is that the ship that many of them sailed on, the passenger list still exists, and it carries the first and last names of the people on board. That's a very important and rare kind of document because enslaved people often appear nameless or only with first names. So we had a link to that document and said, do you have a family name on this list? Are you Black and Catholic and from Southern Maryland, where these Jesuit plantations were from? Are you Black and Catholic and from, this particular town in Louisiana where many people still remain, Maringouin? Share your stories with us. Scores of people wrote to us, and this descendant community, which started with about a handful of people, now numbers more than 6,000.
And so, I mean, as a point of both journalism and for the man who contacted you, I think it's important, the power of skepticism, when that he had the presence of mind to say, really, all 272 of them died as soon as they were sold, and there are no descendants? To question things when they call for questioning. And then to do the digging, and it resulted in, and I sent some students on campus this week an update on this story, because in September of this academic year, the beginning of this academic year, Georgetown announced that they were making a gift of 27 million.
Georgetown and the Jesuits together.
Georgetown and the Jesuits together of 27 million to add to the beginnings of a gift, and the goal is to raise $100 million in a trust or an endowment for these descendants. To do what?
Yeah, I think it's important to know kind of what has happened since that first story ran. Georgetown has apologized for its participation in the American slave trade and for the enslavement and sale of these people. The Jesuits have as well. They have established preference in admissions for descendants, effectively, legacy status for descendants at Georgetown. They also established what they call a reconciliation fund, prodded again by students who voted to impose a fee on themselves because they felt like the institution was moving too slowly to create a kind of fund. Georgetown is committed to raising $400,000 a year to benefit programs to help descendants. The first grants went out last year. And the Jesuits, on their part, partnered with a group of descendants to establish a foundation, and they have committed to raise this $100 million to benefit descendants and racial reconciliation programs around the country. It is the largest effort by the Roman Catholic Church to try to make amends for this history.
And when you say try to make amends, the reason that we are offering this event in sequence with these others, including the cost of inheritance, because what make amends means in this case is it is a concrete, established form, an act of reparations.
And it's really been quite interesting because, when I wrote the first story, I think it was a time when, and it seems hard to believe, again, 2016, when it was just impossible to imagine reparations. At least for me, I didn't think I would ever see it. But these Georgetown and the Jesuits, Georgetown particularly, was among this, in the forefront of this group of institutions that are taking concrete steps, literally giving out money, grants, wrestling with this history. And I think it's really important to know that, of course, when you're looking at slavery fueling the growth of institutions, contemporary institutions, we're not just talking about Georgetown, we're not just talking about universities, we're not just talking about the Catholic Church, right? We're talking about churches in America. We're talking about universities. There are more than 90 universities now that are part of a consortium of universities studying slavery. We're not just talking about universities, we're talking about the financial sector, we're talking about banks, we're talking about life insurance companies. And we're in a moment right now where this work is actively happening. Fledgling, yes. Episcopal Church, municipalities, Evanston, Illinois, the state of California, New York, the governor of New York just announced recently that they were establishing a commission to consider reparations for slavery. This, of course, is coming at a time when there are great headwinds, though, right? Politicians around the country are trying to stop the teaching of this history on race and slavery, to take books out of libraries. So you have these parallel tracks running at the same time.
And I think it's important to sort of make the connection to our current, the issues framing society now, because I think it's easy to look at a book like this and say, that's a history book. That happened a long time ago. And why would I read that? Or yeah, that happened a long time ago, it was bad, but what does it have to do with today? And so when you did this reporting, this story, it led to several other stories
Yeah.
about institutions, many New York-based, because you were writing for the New York Times and based there. Talk about some of the other work that came after this.
So I wrote a piece about New York Life, for instance. The large insurance company, which, got its start in the 1800s in the slave insurance business. This is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but if you consider that enslaved people were property, and if you have a car, and it gets damaged, you want to get a little money back. Enslavers had the same sense that, wow, this might be my most valuable asset. If this person is maimed or dies, and it's important to know that enslaved people, we often think about, field work, the large plantations, but enslaved people worked on steamboats, in mines, in factories, that they wanted to find a way to recoup their losses. And New York Life said, here's the way to do it. Slave insurance. If this person dies, we'll recoup, a portion of their value. And not only was New York Life involved in this and got its start in part through this business, but there was a whole network of people that supported this. There were doctors who had to assess, the human property and, how healthy they were, and when you think about the slave economy, you realize how broadly the tentacles infiltrated the economy. And New York, which we often think of, in our good guy, bad guy thing, the North and the South, but New York was the heart of the economy, and a lot of these merchants and business people relied on the plantations, cotton from the South, or insurance policies from the South to fuel business.
So what has been the result of, you said there are now 6,000 descendants who are advocating? What is the practical result of the story, the book, the social awareness of this story?
It's an interesting thing. I always say, people, when we wrote that piece and, all these people start writing in and learning about their connection to this history, many of them still Catholic. I like to say that, they wept, they raged, and then they organized. They really pressed the institutions to do something. They wrote to Rome. They pressed the leader of the Jesuits worldwide and got a commitment from him that the leadership in the United States would sit down and negotiate with them. Many of them have very mixed feelings about the process as it has evolved. Some have felt that the initial foundation that the descendants were calling for, they wanted a $1 billion foundation. The Jesuits say that's still a goal, but many people feel this $100 million that they are trying to fundraise for. It shouldn't be fundraising that funds it. There are people, so people are divided. People have all kinds of ideas about what should happen. But I think one of the things that most surprised me, all of this has surprised me, was that the other thing that the descendants are doing is, putting back together what was torn apart, their families. They are holding reunions in Louisiana and last year in Maryland. They are meeting on Zoom. They are sharing photographs and family stories, and they are stitching together families that were torn apart in 1838. That's
really powerful, a powerful outcome. And before we go to questions, I want to ask a process question of you, because we are a journalism organization. We are journalists. And I think anytime we have this many people gathered in a room, it's important to sort of add a question, because there's so much detail, numerical detail about the costs of things and debt, and detail about what the plantation was like, what the seasons were like. There are things about meteor showers and an eclipse. And how do you do this work? What is the process for a reporter or a historian? There's not a great deal of difference. Where do you start? How do you keep track of information as you find it? And how do you figure out, when did you know what the story was?
So, as I mentioned, I started with the idea that the way to engage an audience was to tell the story of how this American institution, the largest religious denomination in the country, emerged. Its origin story in slavery was to focus on a family, to tell a story. So again, 272 people were sold, scores of families. Which one? I wanted to tell the story of a family that was split, divided by the sale. I wanted to tell the story because, as I mentioned, really for me as a journalist, the connections to now are really important. So I wanted a family where there were living descendants, on this side of time, who I could talk to. And so I have kind of had a multi-pronged approach. I interviewed folks who were living. I knew kind of some of these families, who they were. I interviewed descendants. And then I went back to see what I could find in the archives about the families themselves. And, this is really difficult, thrilling, but difficult work, because, as you may know, enslaved people by law and by practice are barred, typically barred from learning to read and write. So the kind of materials that historians often rely on, letters and journals, are, and of course newspapers are available, but they were not writing about enslaved people as whole, full people in their lives, right? So you're looking for threads. A little of, people are written about, appear in the records as property. The Jesuits, as I mentioned, kept lots of records, so I looked to see what I could find there. What I knew I had settled on something important with the Mahonies when I discovered those legal records that I mentioned to you. The Mahonies went to court in the late 1700s and sued the Jesuits. That lawsuit exists in the Maryland State Archives. And that was really the determining factor for me, because it had, depositions, the voices of Anne Joyce, her descendants, talking about her grandson, talking about what had happened. And so and the white people who had known her, had seen her, they were elderly people who had known her or heard stories about her. So with those records, I was able to carry that story from, when the first Jesuits arrive in Maryland, really that period of the 1600s, because Anne Joyce arrives in the late 1600s, all the way to the sale and beyond. But, letters, Civil War, some of these folks who were sold and ended up in Louisiana fought for the Union Army. There were Civil War pension records, census records, sale records. I tell the story of two sisters who were split up in the sale, Anna and Louisa. Anna gets shipped off to Louisiana. Louisa remains, and she lives a long time. And the priests who knew her wrote about her as well. So, all of those threads are some of the things that I use to kind of put it together.
And Anna and Louisa, the daughters of Harry Mahoney.
Right, the one who saved the church's wealth in
1812.
1812. Yep.
Anna and Louisa, we get to know them from the time they're quite young, and they're close bonds as sisters, so close as sisters that when they each have children, they name their firstborn daughters after one another.
Right.
And
And when I realized that, there's so much that you don't know, but when you stumble across something like that, that's really, that's wonderful. It really said something about the relationship between these.
And the calculations that Harry has to make, because the book covers so much time that by the time the sale happens, you realize the lengths to which, even at some point, deciding not to try to appeal for freedom or to escape because he didn't want his family to be broken up. And he had been promised that they would be kept together and never sold. And so you see the calculations of this one man to keep his family together. And then do you mind reading the day, when Carberry says run, and then there's the sale? I think we didn't talk a lot about Carberry, but
I mentioned that, there were priests who disagreed and viewed Black people differently, lonely voices, but Father Carberry was among them.
I don't know if that's the best place you can.
Let me see. Back at Georgetown, Milady readied himself once again for the road. Ruthan, who was the leader of the Jesuits worldwide, had ordered him to keep families together and warned that missteps might provoke divine retribution. It would be better to suffer financial disaster than suffer the loss of our souls with the sale of the slaves. Milady carried the weight of that warning with him as he prepared for the journey, but it would not deter him. On October 31st, 1838, he picked up his diary. Set out for St. Inigo's, he wrote. That's a plantation where the Mahonies live. Somehow, someone got word to Father Carberry. The slave traders were coming. He knew he could not mount a blockade to stop the roundup, but he decided he would do what he could to protect the people. When Milady finally arrived at the plantation, he presided over a mass for the faithful and prayed once again for his own soul. But the leader of the Maryland Jesuits had a mission to accomplish, and he did what he had come to do. Soon, cries of terror and sorrow filled the air. Word spread through the dilapidated cabins where weary parents were sleeping with their children and through the fields where they were laboring. But Carberry had taken matters into his own hands. In a flagrant act of defiance against his superior, he had sought out members of the Mahoney family. Run, he told them, run.
Questions?
First of all, great conversation, and glad you're here. When you asked a question about how many knew about the story, I was embarrassed to say I did, because I used to be a big-time Georgetown fan. When I found out about the story of 1838, I stopped being a fan. And I say that because we have to know our history. And I applaud all the young people that are here today to learn about this story, as well as everyone in attendance. We cannot be in a society to do away with history. Confronting history in the case of reparations has to be something that people appreciate and accept. I don't blame current people in society today. I blame their ancestors just as I cry for my ancestors. And I think that's what's important when it comes to reparations. Right now, today, we have migrants coming from another country that are getting health care, fed, and housing. How do we make sense of that in the so-called greatest country in America? So thank you for your story, and thank you for being here.
Celeste?
I just wonder, this is such a fascinating conversation, and I wonder if you can talk about the process by which enslaved people were acquired by the church. Were some inherited through priest families? Talk about the purchase process, the degree to which they participated in that, Can you talk to us about how the number came to be the number?
Yeah, so very good question. You know, all of those ways. So, you know, priests inherited people from, you know, the Catholics in Maryland, I mentioned it had been established as a refuge because Catholics were discriminated against in England, but they also, when Protestants took control, they were also discriminated against in Maryland, and Catholics were largely, even though they were barred from political life and faced a raft of discriminatory laws, they were wealthy for the most part. They economically they did well. So there was this, you know, inheritance process that happened. But they also bought people as well, and so it was really both of those ways of you know,
And
getting people.
there was something about the law that changed where indentured servants had been favored at one point, and then
That's right. I mean, so they were taxed. You know, there was an effort because, again, this was targeting Catholics. There was concern about the Irish presence or growing Irish presence, and so there was a tax on Irish indentured servants, for instance. Yeah.
and so what does that mean? So that once
So it made it harder. That contributed to kind of this transition to a reliance on slave labor. Sure.
so this
I have it. Hi, Rachel.
Hey.
Haven't seen you since your wedding.
Hey.
Old friend of her husband. It's wonderful to have you here. As a journalist who has chased down stories, not like this, but something similar, when you have so much, 272 people, you talked about finding your narrative in the story. And the book isn't really that long, it's only about 300 pages. So I have to believe that there's a nugget or a story or a coincidence or something that you didn't get into the book that killed you to delete. And I want to know what it is, and if there's maybe like a second place family that you would have used.
The descendants want to know that.
So-
Who is that?
So that's my question. Thank you.
that's a great question.
Oh, I mean, so yeah, of course. I mean, the cutting room floor, right, is full of material. You know, it's really hard. It's a very good question and a hard question to answer because there was so much. I have so much material, and there is only so much I can use. I'll tell you one story, which I will probably put together in some form, which is about. You know, I mentioned that there were some of the folks who were sold joined the Union Army, and there's a story of one of those soldiers. Before the war, he married a woman on the plantation in Louisiana, and the son of the enslaver took her away. Raped her, took her to another plantation, and barred her from seeing her husband. And I mentioned in terms of the documents, you know, that have been useful to me, there are Civil War pension records, and these are amazing records. And it tells the story. She is applying for a pension many years later, and she talks about how her husband snuck over to that plantation where she had been taken away to see her. About how when he was going to enlist in the Union Army, he went to her and told her that he was going and that he would come and find her. And after the war, when they were free, both free people, they came and found each other and remained together, reunited and remained together. They weren't Mahoney's. And I haven't been able.
Isn't that the movie?
I feel like there are many movies. But it was a love story. And just the adversity that they experienced, and the determination to, in the midst of all that, to stay together is on the cutting room floor, but maybe not for long. Not in here, but maybe somewhere else.
Thank you for this inspiring story and session. I have two related questions, and that's kind of taking our present American context and looking at it more globally. One is, what has Rome, the Catholic Church in Rome, the Pope, and the hierarchy there had to say about what is happening now in 2024 with this issue of reparations and what Georgetown is doing? And secondly, and related to that, if they've commented on that, have they commented on anything like this happening in other countries? Unfortunately, of course, the U.S. was not the only society with slavery. Is this reparations conversation is this reparations conversation happening in other countries around the world?
Yeah, very good questions. In 2000, I mentioned that the descendants, because they were unhappy and concerned about the pace of the discussions with Georgetown and the Jesuits, reached out to the leader of the Jesuits in Rome in, I think it was 2017, and received a letter back where, he described it as, a sin against God and against, us here. And said that the provincials who are run the way the structure is in the United States, the territories in the United States, would negotiate. I don't know what, if anything, Pope Francis has had to say about it. The fundraising has gone slower than expected, and I know that there have been efforts by some descendants to reach out to Rome to press them to do more. And I don't know kind of what Rome's position has been on that. In terms of the international question, it's an excellent question. I mean, the Jesuits, in fact, enslaved more people in Latin America than they did in the United States. And many countries, are this, the history of slavery is, not unique here. The UK, there's talk about reparations in the Caribbean. There is, I believe, in Brazil recently I read something. So I think there's a lot of discussions about kind of how do we grapple with this history today and what we do about it.
And one of the 4 events happening in this series is being sponsored by the Donia Human Rights Center, and it is on the global case for reparations. So not specific to the Catholic Church and the Jesuits, but on Haiti and Brazil and other places where there's a very active conversation about reparations happening now. And that event is Monday at 4, right? Yeah. And I know we have it on our website, and we can, before we leave, mention the room and where it is specifically.
Yeah, I was brought up a Catholic, and my mother was very abusive, and I called her a Catholic. And then, went through, Catholic high school where slavery was not talked about at all. And, I just started doing research on my own. And I got to tell you, that the more I learned, and because of my history as a child, I really hated the Catholic Church. And I am not a Catholic now, I'm a pagan. And, I've continued to read books on slavery, and, and that doesn't make me, that has not changed my feeling towards the Catholic Church. So it's really hard for me when you say you're a Catholic, and it's really hard for me to wrap my head around that.
I know. You aren't the only one.
Yeah, it is. And,
You know what I say, though, sometimes is that when people say, okay, how can you be Catholic? I say, where would I go? The Baptists enslaved people. The Quakers enslaved people before they didn't. Where would I bank? Where would I go to school?
yeah.
Slavery was foundational here. There's no running from it unless I want to, move into exile, and then where?
Yeah. Well, yes. And slavery, pretty much the Catholic Church pretty much started it in this country. Ferdinand and Isabel sent Columbus out to the United States, and after all the Native Americans were murdered in the Caribbean, then they were looking around, who's going to do our work? Who's going to do work for us? And so that's when, slaves were started to be brought to the New World. So it's really hard for me. I have a lot of anger, and I also, when I'm reading these books and I'm listening to you folks, I'm thinking, I want to step out of my head and into my heart and, in some way connect to these people who lost their lives. Their lives were taken away from them, whether, it was Catholics that were doing it or Protestants or whoever. And so I came to hear you talk about this because I wanted to hear you present your side of the story. And, there's this wall here, but, maybe I can understand why black people would want to be a Catholic or Protestant.
I wonder if that's the question. I mean, I think, it's interesting for you to express anger, and I think it's hard to do this reporting and write about these things without feeling anger. But I think all African Americans have to, what would happen if we were all really angry about everything? I don't think anybody wants to know. And at some point you have to, I think this is so true. We were talking about this earlier today. Where would you go to be free of the vestiges of slavery? Where would we turn? And so at some point,
It's part of the reason why, I do this work, is to illuminate the history and to make it known. And for people to understand that this isn't like, history books on a shelf, dusty shelf, forgotten. It lives with us, and we have to reckon with it. Yeah. And that's the work that I think that we do as journalists. Yeah. I think there was a question up there.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic. I just wanted to note that when you talked a little bit about the insurers in New York Life, they actually insured people on the boats actually going across. And they were sort of doubly insured so that the crossing and then also once they arrived. And the second thing I wanted to add was that a lot of law schools, but definitely U of M, has a pretty robust program on law and history, and there are case studies about trying to cite case law, so some of these court cases that actually refer back to the precedent is as enslaved people as property and tracing that history. So this is really just excellent. And a plug for St. Mary's, the Catholic Church on campus. We're also doing an event based on this with some Georgetown priests that are going to come, and we're going to talk about that next month. So
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. I'm also a Catholic.
Oh, thank you.
Great to have you here. As a practicing Catholic, when the story first broke in the New York Times, I tried to follow it as much as I possibly could. And very interesting, to my knowledge, never known that happened. But since then, I've been reading and trying to find out, and maybe you're more knowledgeable in regards to, have you heard anything from Pope Francis comments on something like this? Nope.
I have not.
Just thank you. I just wanted to. Okay.
There's all the way in the back.
Sorry
Thank
for
you,
making you do
Alexis.
the stairs. My name is Ezekiel. I'm a Christian theological scholar and a student at the Ford School. And there's been a lot of discussion about what reparations might look like. People say, oh, 40 acres and a mule, let's bring that back. Or, some other, let's do big economic calculations. Scripture has a depiction of reparations in the story of Zacchaeus, where he pays back 4 times more what he robbed from people. Do you have a personal calculation of what reparations should look like in the United States?
That's an interesting passage. And no, so I'm not. So I'm a journalist of the old school. I write about this history. I illuminate this history, but I don't weigh in on policy. I can give you a sense of some of the efforts that are being made right now, what they look like, to just give you a flavor. Georgetown, for instance, is offering grants to programs that provide, for instance, legal services or educational services to descendants. The Virginia Theological Seminary, an Episcopal seminary, is actually, cutting checks. They basically have decided that, what they participated in, both in terms, they look at the enslaved people who worked at the seminary, as well as the folks who were discriminated against employees during the Jim Crow era, and they view it as wage theft. And they say that, let's not say that we can't talk about money or shouldn't talk about money. We can't make up what was lost, but we are going to give checks to these families. For instance, Evanston, Illinois is focusing on housing and helping people with housing. So there are a lot of different efforts going on around the country. There's also, some smaller efforts, kind of private reparations, where white families who do this research are, themselves trying to reach out to descendants. There's a group of that is made up of the descendants of enslavers and the descendants of enslaved people, called Coming to the Table. And in small ways, some people are, giving, scholarship money or repairing tombstones at a cemetery. So there are lots of initiatives happening.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation and talk. Did you face pushback from the Jesuits or Georgetown or the Catholic Church as you started to right on the topic?
It's a good question. You know, I like to say when you get a call from the New York Times saying, hey, we're looking into the history of your institution's ties to slavery, it's not really always the most welcome call people get. But in terms of Georgetown, I have to say that, you know, they had from the very beginning, you know, like in 2015, before students started protesting the names of these buildings that carried the names of these priests who were involved in the sale, had decided that they were going to grapple with this history. And, you know, that was their commitment to do. And, you know, I would also say as a journalist that people don't always give us everything that we want. And so I would say that, you know, they decided to do this. I think people look around the country, scholars who look at this feel that they have really taken the lead in grappling with this. They see it as, you know, as Catholics, as an issue of repair and reconciliation, that is something important that they need to do. At the same time, I would also say that I think it was in 2017, it was a year or two, I think it was a year or two after I started work, that I got, you know, a kind of cloaked email from someone saying they're hiding records. I was like, I've got a deep throat. All right. Yeah. This person, who I ultimately spoke to, told me that Georgetown had discovered a whole batch of records that were previously, you know, that are not cataloged, that had not been discovered before. I don't know, I mean, this person was very concerned that Georgetown was going to try and conceal these records. I don't know whether that was the case or not. I certainly, once I knew about the records, asked to see the records, and I did see the records. These were really important documents. They were financial ledgers. One of the things that was commonly understood before I started doing this research was that Georgetown and the Jesuits never got all of the money from the sale. That the main buyers from Louisiana had financial problems and couldn't pay, so they got the down payment, and that was pretty much it. These ledgers documented payments that went on into the 1860s. Really important, and also documented, you know, again, Milady's dream of establishing this network of schools, demonstrated how money went from the Jesuits after 1838 to places like Holy Cross and Loyola University, Maryland, which this week just announced that it was going to be embarking on, you know, looking at ways to do a form of reparations to descendants and helping other institutions in other ways. So, you know, you know, I'd like to think that Georgetown would have volunteered those records to me anyway, but I was really grateful to that person who let me know.
Thank you so much for your hard work. I didn't know anything about this. I'm so glad I came today. I came in from Boston yesterday, driving, and I'm so glad I was invited to come to this event. But thank you for your work. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your tenacity. And I just want to ask, how do you find out if you are a descendant of the 272?
So Georgetown has created something that's called the Georgetown Slavery Archive. It's a digital archive. If you Google it, you'll find it. That's like the first place to start. They have that shipping manifest, and you can look at the names of the families who were on board. the Georgetown Memory Project, which is an independent nonprofit established by Richard Cellini, the guy who got this all started, is dedicated to identifying, researching and identifying descendants. So you can find them online and reach out as well.
One last question, and I think we're going to invite Book Suite to come up to the front. Alexis, there's a question here.
Thank you so much. I'm so impressed with all the research you did. You mentioned at the beginning that you had sort of been told by historians that to just sort of bracket off the moral questions of these characters that you uncovered. And I wonder if personally, if you found a way of thinking about people in this time, about the Jesuits who were involved, both the one who said to run and the ones who, in Milady maybe. Where do you see them sort of falling personally in their own struggles, and how could we learn, what should we think about that today, I guess is the question.
You know, it's interesting, you know, like I said, these were complicated people. Carberry, who urged people to run, had a very different vision. He saw Black people as in his letters, he writes about, you know, their capacity, craftsmanship. He created an experiment on the plantation that he was in charge of managing, saying that, you know, the Jesuits always grumbled that, you know, these enslaved people weren't working hard enough. And Carberry's like, well, maybe we should pay them. And he, you know, said, let's divide up the land on the farm. You know, you guys, families get a certain number of acres. You grow what you see fit. Let's share in, you know, the proceeds. And when a Jesuit, Irish Jesuit from, senior Jesuit from Ireland came to observe, noticed, you know, how much better the plantation was doing. At the same time, I mentioned that Louisa, one of the two sisters, ran off, and because he urged her to, she was able to get her mother and to hide in the woods until the slave traders were gone. And I thought, oh, Father Carberry, my hero. And of course, life isn't like that. Louisa comes back from the woods with her mother, and Father Carberry welcomes her back into slavery, where she remains until the 1860s. So very, very complicated. I guess, you know, what I often think when people ask about, you know, the priests, I think, you know, we do ask ourselves often, you know, like, how could they? And I think actually what I think about more now is about the people who could. Like, actually, that feels like a bigger question. I think a lot about the abolitionists who looked around at a slave society and imagined a different world and were willing to fight for one when it seemed impossible. And I think about that a lot in terms of the world we live in now. What seems fine to us now? Like, what are we accepting? What are we tolerating? That's kind of what I think about when I think about kind of how they fit. I'm inspired by the folks who, you know, in the face of what was just normal, asked the questions and challenged the system.
I think thank you for that question, and I think that's a great place to end because it leaves us with questions. And I think as journalists, you know, when we do our work, I think really great stories, when you finish both the reporting and the consuming, you end with more questions than you started with. And that means it was a good piece of work. And so thank you for a good piece of work.
Thank you.
Yeah.